Thank you, colleagues. I would like to welcome everyone with us today, as well as those listening to us online on the Senate's website, sencanada.ca. We are meeting tonight to continue our study of the subject matter of those elements contained in Divisions 1, 2, 24, 28, and 29 of Part 5 of Bill C-15, Budget 2025, Implementation Act Number 1. This evening, we will hear from witnesses specifically on Division 1, which creates the High-Speed Rail Network Act. With that, I would like to introduce our first panel. From the Assembly of First Nations, Quebec, Labrador, Chief Francis Vero-Paul. From the Assembly of First Nations, Ontario, Regional Chief Abram Benedict and Julie McGregor, Chief of Staff. From Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, Sandra Schwartz, National Executive Director. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Witnesses will provide opening remarks of approximately 5 minutes. If you could keep to the 5 minutes, we would appreciate that, which will be followed by question and answer session with senators. I will now invite Chief Vero-Paul to give his opening remarks. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm Chief of the Assembly of First Nation, Quebec, Labrador. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present today on Part 5, Division 1 of Bill C-15. This bill empowers via HFR Inc. or its successor to plan and build an Ontario-Quebec high-speed corridor. The proposed project crosses the territories of several First Nations, including the Wabanaki, the Wendat, the Innu, the Atikamekw, and the Kanyan-Kenaga on the Quebec side. The route is declared works for the general advantage of Canada, streamlining federal oversight and pre-approving construction, while limiting recourse to the Canadian Transportation Agency to challenge approvals. But this bill also raises questions about the duty to consult and to accommodate, as well as to abide by the principle of free, prior, and informed consent on the part of First Nation. Comme dans la loi C5, ce projet de loi exempte.
As in Bill C5, this bill exempts railways from the authorization required under 68, Regulation 68, given that the federal government will not be able to use the normal approach to Indigenous peoples, the requirements for consultation and accommodation are reduced, which could be contrary to our interests.
Land acquisition and expropriation powers, as proposed in this bill, risk of sidestep meaningful review and remedies for affected First Nation. While simplifying or accelerating a process is not an issue in and of itself, it is worth noting that there's no clear mechanism, let alone a clear exemption pertaining to First Nation reserved or ancestral lands. Expropriation cannot be treated as a routine instrument of convenience. It directly engages constitutional protection under Section 35 and the Crown's UNDRIP commitments, including free, prior, and informed consent, which Canada pledged to align federal laws with through the UNDRIP Act process. Senators, one thing is clear. Consultation and consent must be concrete and immediate, not just theoretical. If Canada insists this high-speed corridor is for the general advantage, then the right of first refusal on any Crown or corporate acquisition of lands and interests within our territories must clearly confirm on what lands this mechanism is applied or of before expropriation is even contemplated. In this case, Section 8.1 to 11 do not make any clear specification about ancestral or reserved lands. Does it mean that this provision applies to First Nation and our territories? Does it mean that the government of Canada and the developer can override the duty to consult and to accommodate First Nation prior to exercising this right of refusal? Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. As in the Impact Assessment Act, Indigenous knowledge is referenced concerning confidentiality and public disclosure. But the collection or generation of knowledge stemming from First Nation can still be used and disclosed in direct contravention to our own protocols on intellectual property. Under the OCAP principle, ownership, control, access, and possession, First Nation own and govern data about our lands and peoples. Any data collection, storage, sharing, and publication must be governed by nation-specific OCAP agreements with community-level stewardship, data residency guarantees, and access protocols First Nations set for themselves. OCAP is not optional. It is the minimum standard for First Nation data governance. Unlike other provisions, paragraph 25.6 of the bill is potentially concerning. It could mean First Nation lose any real way to challenge if their knowledge gets shared, unless they can prove bad faith or that it was unreasonable. That puts a huge burden of proof on our communities. If the High-Speed Rail Network Act proceeds in its current form through potential and unilateral expropriation powers and extractive practices, it will run against what Prime Minister Carney concluded at the Assembly of First Nations last week. National interest projects can and must be carriers of reconciliation. As he said just a week ago, any major project must be informed by and can only move forward with First Nations. The task is simple. The Government of Canada and developers must engage in government-to-government relations, treat our knowledge and data as sacred, and consider our lands as living relations. Tinishko maintenant. Merci tout le monde.
Merci, Chef Véropol. J'invite maintenant
Thank you,
Chef
Chief Veropol. I now invite Chief Benedict to provide us with his opening statement.
I am Abram Bedick, the Ontario Regional Chief, and I'm a member of the Mohawk-Sauvage-Kwesistoh. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here gathered on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. Thank you for the committee for the invitation to appear along with my colleague, Regional Chief Laurent Paul for the Quebec Labrador region. This summer, we watched as the Government of Canada rammed through legislation in less than 20 days. During that time, First Nations successfully advocated for the removal of the Indian Act from the scope of the legislation because we wanted to prevent our lands from being expropriated on a basis of moving national interest projects forward. First Nations maintain sovereignty over their lands, waters, and territories, and any attempts to amend legislation must include free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations. The Government of Canada is once again attempting to advance major project development by overriding First Nation inherent right and jurisdiction, this time through amendments to the High-Speed Rail Network Act contained in this omnibus legislation C-15. The amendments to the High-Speed Rail Network Act provides broad authority to surrender, enter, and ultimately expropriate lands deemed for the rail development. Without explicit protection, these powers could be used to target First Nations lands. The Act bypasses the normal regulatory review process for this type of project. First Nations have seen this type of behavior before from Canada. Bill C-5, which enacted the Building Canada Act, is designed to fast-track major projects while setting aside First Nations rights, and this is concerning. The high-speed rail legislation reflects the same pattern and the complete disregard for First Nations' inherent rights. Rather than streamlining processes, this act causes further uncertainty by ignoring Canada's obligations in relationship to First Nations. Canada is committed to the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That includes the obligations to free, prior, informed consent and informed consent before approving any project that impacts First Nation rights, First Nations lands, and First Nations territories. Article 10 of the United Nations Declaration prohibits the forced removal of Indigenous people from their lands. Article 32 further provides that Indigenous people have the right to determine development priorities that occurs on their lands. The High-Speed Rail Network Act, as drafted, does not meet these standards. As amended, the Act greatly expands federal powers to expropriate lands. These powers could potentially apply to First Nations lands and could cause harm to the First Nations. Because of Canada's history of land theft for railway and the importance of land to First Nations, strong legal safeguards are essential. The Act must prohibit expropriation of First Nations lands without free, prior, and informed consent. First Nations are rightful decision makers of our lands. The Government of Canada cannot use legislation to sidestep our rights simply because they want to build faster. When First Nations raised concerns about the expropriation of Indian lands under the Canada Building Act, Canada removed the Indian Act from the legislation. Even with those amendments, this was being added back in this legislation. The railway provision in C-15 is now threatened to recreate the same pathway for federal overreach that First Nations have fought to stop. C-15 cannot and must not proceed like this without amendments. Parliament should consider amending the legislation to specify that First Nations lands are protected from expropriation. The AFN will provide committee with specific language for proposal amendments once following this submission. The fiduciary duty owed to First Nations and constitutional rights of First Nations cannot be undone through legislation. Removing legislative safeguards that Canada usually relies on for upholding its fiduciary obligations or its duty to consult and accommodate does not make First Nation rights go away. But it does create additional uncertainty. It forces First Nations and the Crown to develop new and untested methods for recognizing the constitutional rights of First Nations. The legislation is simply another attempt to use legislation to dispossess First Nations of our land and sidestep our inherent rights through legislation. I want to thank the committee again for the opportunity to speak tonight, and I look forward to the questions later.
Thank you, Chief Benedict. I will now invite Ms. Schwartz to give her opening remarks. Go ahead, Ms. Schwartz.
Good evening, Senators. Bonsoir. Je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about Bill C-15.
I'm the National Executive Director of an organization called the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. We're also known as CPAWS. We were founded more than 60 years ago, and we're the only charity in Canada dedicated to the protection of public land, freshwater, and ocean. And we have regional offices, 13 of them, across the country from the Yukon through to Newfoundland, along with our national office here in Ottawa. I'd like to start with first acknowledging that we are gathered on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, who are the customary keepers of the Ottawa watershed. And it's also known in this area as Kitchissippi. And I would like to express my deep appreciation to the Algonquin peoples for their role as the traditional guardians of this place, and for their ongoing stewardship of these lands and waters. This evening, Senators, as you've heard from witnesses, there are concerns with some of the Canada's proposed major projects. And I guess it will come as no surprise that coming from an environmental group, that there are concerns with the process as laid out by both regional chiefs. One such proposal under consideration, however, is the Alto High-Speed Rail project, which will become Canada's first high-speed railway spanning approximately 1,000 kilometres from Toronto to Quebec City. And CPAWS certainly does recognize that a high-speed rail network would be a transformative project. Those of my colleagues who are in the climate community certainly do see that this is a bold investment in clean, efficient transportation. But we also know that so-called nation-building projects come with significant responsibilities. And some of those choices shape our economy, our communities, and our environment for generations. So we need to find a balance between supporting Canada's natural environment and our economy. Nature is not an obstacle to progress. It is the foundation of our economy, security, and our well-being. When natural systems are damaged, the costs show up in flood recovery, bills, in insurance payouts, and in lost productivity. And protecting nature is not just a box to check, it is smart economics. And by integrating nature protection into our development strategies, Canada can build a future where economic growth and environmental stewardship can go hand in hand. And I would as well say it is also a future that includes reconciliation. So this will only be made possible by making biodiversity conservation a core part of decision making. Needs to consider climate resilience and environmental protection, ensuring neither is overlooked in the pursuit of progress in record time. And respecting Indigenous rights and leadership with meaningful Indigenous engagement and public participation in planning. And I will underscore that last point. These principles are more than theoretical. They need to guide every major development undertaken in Canada, including the Alto high-speed rail project. If planned responsibly, this rail network could represent real innovation and modernization of transportation in Eastern Canada. However, this also means choosing the least environmentally harmful route rather than the most direct or cheapest option. This route needs to be identified using best available science and traditional knowledge. Identifying wetlands, wildlife hotspots, and species at risk zones, then implementing strong mitigation measures to prevent train-wildlife collisions will be important, and embedding Indigenous leadership in project design, planning, construction, and monitoring. And that also will include appropriate consultation and consideration of input. Ensuring that data collected in long-term monitoring of environmental variables is both open access and used in adaptive responses, thereby maintaining the integrity of both infrastructure and environment over time. Together, these steps will protect critical habitats, reduce wildlife collisions, uphold Indigenous leadership, and create transparency, leading to a strengthening of Canadians' trust in development projects. These safeguards, frankly, are not optional. They are the standard for a future where economic growth and environmental stewardship go hand in hand. So it will be critical for major projects like this one to follow all applicable laws and regulations. Elsewhere in the government's omnibus budget bill, namely Division 5 of Part 5, there's language that would undermine this principle, and we encourage this committee, as well as other committees studying this legislation in advance, to consider whether this is reasonable. I would argue that Division 5, Part 5 is not. Canada's economic future depends on more than concrete, oil, and steel. It depends on the natural systems that quietly sustain our health, safety, and prosperity. Creating a conservation economy means treating nature as a strategic asset, not an afterthought. It means investing in ecosystems the way we invest in infrastructure, because nature is the foundation that shields us from disasters, supports clean air and water, and helps stabilize our climate. And as First Nations teachings have also taught us as settlers, they are our relations, and we should treat them with the same level of respect. As Canada embraces nation-building projects through Bills C-15 and the Building Canada Act, we also need to build this conservation economy. So at a time of economic uncertainty, overlooking nature as a strategic asset is not just a policy failure, it's a national risk with generational consequences. So 2 key steps to creating an economy that values natural systems that underpin our long-term prosperity are first renewing critical nature funding that supports and protects Canada's natural assets like national parks and funding for Indigenous guardians. Second, including natural capital such as forest, wetlands, grasslands, and other ecosystems into the public accounts of Canada before the costs of inaction become irreversible. So with the current economic uncertainties and volatilities, Canada's natural capital is an overlooked competitive advantage. When we fund nature conservation and embed it in critical decisions, we support our nation's economic independence, reduce risk, strengthen resilience and productivity, and we create a foundation for lasting economic security. So, Senators, Canada's natural advantage is more than our vast, diverse, and abundant natural resources, as I've stated. And our national parks and other protected areas are more than just tourist destinations. They are powerful economic assets. So an economy that invests in natural systems will underpin our long-term national prosperity. It's the path forward, and it's one Canada cannot afford to ignore. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Swartz. We'll now move on to questions from senators. I'd like to advise senators that you'll have approximately 5 minutes each for the first round, and if there's time permitting, we'll have a second round. Should you wish to ask a question, please ask Andrea, and she will put your name on our list. So starting off, Senator Lewis, would you be kind enough to take the first question?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing tonight and taking time. Some of you traveled a long distance to be here, and so certainly appreciate it. We talked about routing for all three of the witnesses, and is there a preferred route now that is more problematic than possible alternatives? And like when I think of First Nations, for instance, is there routing available that wouldn't cross through a First Nation? Just like your opinion on that question, please.
Sure, I can touch on that. I think there's a couple elements to consider. Will there ever be the perfect route? No, absolutely not. Let's be frank about that. 1,000 kilometers through people's backyards, through First Nations territories, through farmlands, through municipalities, is an undertaking in itself. I think that what is missing in the Government of Canada's approach is the process and how in which we get there. We know that through this legislation, the ability to expropriate already puts people on the other end, the rights holders or the landholders or the farmers, at a disadvantage, because it will be a take it or leave it position. And I don't think that that's acceptable. Understanding that the route itself will require sitting at tables, conference tables, in people's homes and coming up with a solution that's going to benefit. And so First Nations are not against development. They are against the erosion of rights and routes that will have damages to the lands and the waters that will be everlasting. And so I think that the legislative approach, the expansion of expropriation powers, is unacceptable.
I could also just add the perspective from a conservation organization would be that it needs to be a corridor that avoids sensitive areas. And again, as the regional chief stated, we are also not against development. We, in fact, recently, as the government announced its intentions with some major projects, the Crawford Mine in Northern Ontario, we would support. We don't support the Ring of Fire because of the challenges with the peatlands that would be carved up as a result, and the greenhouse gas emissions, and just simply peatlands are very sensitive habitats. And so as an organization, we would always be thinking about what we refer to as the mitigation hierarchy, which is the first step in that hierarchy is not offsetting the damage you've done, but avoid it to begin with. So you're avoiding sensitive areas. You want to document the reductions in habitat fragmentation, so that if in fact you need to think about a species as it moves through its habitat, you want to document where that fragmentation is taking place and potentially replace it with another area for the habitat or for the species to continue to move. as you're thinking about ramping up a project like this, you also want to think about the wildlife collisions, and so making sure you're putting mitigation measures in place for that. Indigenous-led monitoring needs to be in place, and that was already spoken to as well, in terms of the knowledge also needs to be held as sacred, and when it is shared, it must not necessarily be shared beyond the proponent and the government. But they also, as peoples who have a deep respect for the land and have a very different relationship with land than settlers do, we would definitely say monitoring should be done by the communities that live off those lands. And then also ensuring that any of the data sets on the environment are publicly accessible, and that there's also demonstrated climate resilient performance.
Chief Vero-Paul to add his comments so that we have initial comments from each individual, but we can mesh them together so we can have a active discussion on the whole issues. Chief, would you give us some feedback, please?
Thank you. I'll be very brief because I don't want to repeat what has been said, because I totally agree with what Regional Chief Benedict has mentioned about the consent and the consultation process. But as I touched in my speech, I mentioned the fact that First Nation also have the right of refusal. So what happens if it does happen? I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I think this is all in. This is relates to the approach that will be built with First Nation regarding the consultation process and the consent process as well. So there's some gray area in what's being proposed in the bill as of now, and the right of refusal is one of them. Thank you.
Your name's Benedict, is how you pronounce it?
Benedict.
Benedict.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm good.
Are you,
I'm finished, yeah.
okay, thank you very much. Moving on, Senator Simons, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What I realized when I became a senator is that every region of the country has a different kind of treaty relationship with the Crown. I introduced myself as coming from Treaty 6 territory because in Alberta, we have numbered treaties, and those treaty rights are fairly well established. So I wanted to understand, both from Chief Vero-Paul and from Regional Chief Benedict, as you're understanding the hypothetical alignment of this rail line, would it go through land that is reserve land or land that is, unsurrendered and unceded? If you understand the difference,
there is a differentiation.
Yeah.
I believe there's a differentiation around that in many legal aspects. I have not seen the route. I mean, I know how to drive
nobody has seen the actual route, but
Yeah.
I just want to get a sense along that alignment.
There would be both,
There would
but
be
it would
both.
predominantly likely traditional territories versus reserve.
Okay.
But the abilities to have expropriation of reserve is quite different than other lands, and this legislation does pave the way for expropriation of reserve lands under the Indian Act, which is unacceptable.
That's what I wanted to clarify. And for Mr. Vero-Paul, would it be the same in Quebec?
Yes, it's exact same.
How?
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea of expropriating reserve land seems very problematic to me. I mean, if one tried that in Treaty 6 territory, there would be extraordinary pushback. So can you explain to me, because I don't know the Indian Act as well as I ought, what are the powers that the Crown has to expropriate under the Indian Act? I mean, how do you expropriate reserve land that's been settled on a nation?
Well, I think that through the existing regime under the Indian Act, it's not completely easy as well. But definitely, the language that's proposed in this gives, the ability for the minister to be satisfied and then go to cabinet to get order in council. I think that
But it's
through the normal
it's
process.
It's your land. I mean, it's not like private property. It's a First Nation.
That's right. But under the provisions as being proposed, it is possible. Right? It gives the government the ability to do that. And I think that's what's also important is that it gives the government the ability to sidestep the Impact Assessment Act and the Transport Canada Act. These are critical checks and balances to protection of lands. And so it paves the way for the government to take land and sidestep all of the checks and balances that Canadians expect from their government.
And for Monsieur Verupal, would you expect there to be nation-to-nation negotiation? I mean, if this is sovereign treaty land, I mean, surely there's a different protocol than expropriating somebody's barn or gas station, because the land is held in common by the First Nation.
Yes, totally. I think, again, I mentioned that earlier, that there's some gray areas, and the one about expropriation is not clear and needs to be clearer. And the fact that what just Regional Chief Benedict just mentioned, I think this is very concerning for us as First Nation. We do have I also want to mention that we do have a recent history in our for some of our communities here in now called Quebec province, that some communities has been moved for some projects in the recent past, and those has really major impacts on the community, on the health of the people, and the fact that they are moved without their consent. So I think this is something to be very, this is very concerning, and yes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
If I've
Ms.
got,
Schwartz, do you have anything
well,
that you wanted to?
I had a separate question for Ms. Schwartz, if
Go
that's
ahead
all right.
then, please.
In terms of threats to wildlife, there would be the threat during construction, which is self-evident. But is there also a unique threat with a high-speed train of ongoing wildlife, and that would be dangerous not just to the wildlife, but to the train? What kind of wildlife mitigation would there need to be? Fencing, overpasses?
Both. So, as you will well know, as a senator from Alberta, that Banff Park was an area where there was a lot of wildlife collisions along the highway up to Banff. It's not uncommon when you put in major linear infrastructure that you're going to face wildlife collisions, and there are well-established mitigation measures. So you can put in things like the wildlife crossings. Those are often those overpasses that you will be familiar with from Alberta. Certainly a lot of the fencing as well, that sort of around the sort of on either side of the roads. We're seeing more and more of that. Again, that may not stop certain species, but larger megafauna you would not necessarily be able to stop through that type of like that. The lower fencing that tends to be more for aquatic species like turtles and so forth not to cross. But for larger ones, typically you'll want to make sure that you're directing them to the safe passages.
Yeah, because
so that
otherwise-
all needs to be included in.
Because otherwise it's a handy-dandy wildlife corridor.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you very much. If there's a second round, I will.
Thank you.
Take
Senator Cormier, c'est à vous.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, je vais poser
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I will be putting my questions in French. My question is about expropriation, but first I would like to put a question about Section 25 of the new legislation, which allows for a number of provisions regarding confidentiality of Indigenous knowledge. So we read,
Minister or the corporation in relation with the high-speed rail network is confidential and must not knowingly be or be permitted to be disclosed without written consent. Je me demande si, d'abord, si...
So I'm wondering whether that wording is acceptable to you as it's written, and I'd like to better understand what confidential information needs to be protected in a project such as this when it concerns Indigenous peoples and their interactions with the government?
I can start with that. I think there's a couple principles that around the confidentiality and the collection of data. Let's not forget that the government has, honor of the crown, duty to consult. These are not just meanings, right? I mean, this is about a relationship between First Nations and the government of Canada. And so having legislation that allows them to do everything pave the way is about a relationship that's going to be started in a negative. So I want to put that forward. So now you're going to believe the partner sitting across from you that they will not divulge confidential information related to, First Nation knowledge. Perhaps part of this route may include traditional territory where medicines that may cultivate there, traditional hunting grounds or ceremonial grounds. This sort of information is not something that communities want general public to know about. And so sharing that information with the government, and them divulging it or just having access to it is problematic. And so I think that, that provision in this legislation is quite concerning to our people.
So are you saying that the way it's written is not strong enough to protect the confidentiality? Is that what you're saying?
I do think that there needs to be some revisions in it, absolutely. But it has to embrace as my colleague said, the principles of OCAP around the collection of this data. I think that there needs to be some serious consideration around how that information is handled. In its current form, it's not acceptable.
Okay. Chef Veropol.
And Chief Veropol. Yes, indeed. As the regional chief has just stated, the principles that I brought up earlier, the OCAP principles, ownership, control, and possession, access and possession, must be applied. So yes, this would require an amendment for this part, you see, because these are factors related to the past, a number of projects in the past, far too often, unfortunately. The data that was gathered in the field or thanks to cooperation of First Nations did not belong to First Nations, but in the current nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship, the paradigm has shifted. Rights have changed, and First Nations now, as of a number of years, have data governance centers, very sensitive data belonging to us. It is of the highest importance that this data be owned first and foremost by the First Nations. And when it comes to building a future, that's something that has to be taken into account, must be part of the plan. Environmental studies as well, let's consider those in which First Nations would like to be involved from the outset. A good deal of data is also gathered in that sort of undertaking. So it's of the highest importance that data involving First Nations be protected under the bill. If I have time, Mr. Chair, I would like to get back to the expropriation issue. I'm not trying to make an inappropriate comparison here, but we do know that within the history of Canada, we're able to point to large projects that have used expropriation. The Parc National Kichoubiak in my area, Acadian land was expropriated and communities were broken up and the culture of the people suffered. So what can you tell me about the effects of expropriation? You've mentioned health, but on the culture of your communities, language, for example. Are you concerned that potential expropriations could undermine and have a negative effect on your community's culture? Yes, indeed. It's of concern to us, very worrisome. Culture, belonging, and territory identification. And what happens if you're expropriated? Where do you go? We've seen the effect that approach is had in our region and many regions where First Nations were removed from their lands, their territories, even though, and let's of course agree that we don't necessarily focus solely on reserves. I mean, ancestral lands, Indigenous lands, it's a much broader concept. We develop our cultures and languages in close relationship with our territories. Allow me to briefly go back to the technical question put by the prior senator. In C-5, not many amendments were carried among those recommended by First Nations, but taking out the Indian Act, taking that out of C-5, I just want to point this out, is something that was of importance to us for the reasons that were mentioned by the prior speaker.
To that question.
Yeah, and I would like to just comment. I'm not positioned as an organization who works on conservation to specifically speak to expropriation, but I think it is important to mention that, as you mentioned, a national park, that is the unfortunate history of conservation in the country, and as both as an organization and as a movement in working in conservation, we have had to reconcile with our past history. And so we recognize that previous parks have been established through the removal of peoples off their lands. And so as we've reconciled with that history, we've worked, for example, with wood buffalo and with the local nation in creating a new process moving forward in terms of how we wish to work with First Nations and other Indigenous communities. And it is an unfortunate and sad history of our country and the establishment of parks, but it is no longer the way that parks and other protected areas are established in Canada.
Merci. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur.
Moving on to Senatrice Milvie Deschênes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Senator Milvie Deschênes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will put my question to Mr. Francis Véropod. I would like a little more information relating to the discussion that you began with my colleague, Senator Simons. Looking at Quebec, the map of Quebec, if I've understood correctly, generally speaking, a high-speed rail would, the tracks would try to remain along the route that currently exists, and in Quebec, that's to the north of the St. Lawrence Seaway through Three Rivers. So that would be the corridor. I mean, not specifically kilometer by kilometer, but more or less there, followed by the route up towards Ottawa. So in this corridor, are there Indigenous communities or, perhaps I don't want to use the word reserve, but, are there Indigenous communities on that or in that corridor? Because I think that Kanawake and Kanasatake aren't on that route. So just try to situate me because you know that better than I do. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Senator. Yeah, thank you. You seem to have far more information than I do about the route because these discussions have taken place with the First Nations in principle.
Directement à votre question.
But I can't answer your question directly because I haven't seen the route itself, nor have I even the possible route. I can't give you an answer because I haven't seen this potential route myself. But what I can remind us is that be it on reserve or not, over reserve lands or not, to indeed use that term, ancestral lands are of the highest importance and are recognized by the First Nations as being under the stewardship of the First Nations on those territories. So be this on reserve or on ancestral land, I would just like to point us back to that principle. The principles, which are very clear and easy to respect, respect by the Government of Canada, the concepts of free, prior, and informed consent. I think this is got to be the cornerstone of any relationship if we intend to build together. And as Regional Chief Benedict was saying at the outset, we are certainly not against development, but our concern is to ensure that our rights or these basic principles be respected. When they aren't, we as First Nations are unable to really respect our own governance structures with our own populations, consultation and so forth, to ensure that there be popular support for the development project. So, sorry not to be able to give you a clear answer to your specific question, but I simply point us back to the basic principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Very well, I understand that, and you're quite right to say that we don't know the route. I understand that for economic reasons that, in Quebec at least, that route will surely, in general, follow along the lines of already existing rail routes, but I would like to know whether your ancestral lands, and forgive me for being so ignorant in this matter, but whether those lands may be along this route, as we can imagine it, or are those lands further north? I can respond that all of what is now called Quebec is our ancestral land, such that, of course, the route being considered between Quebec through Ottawa and, of course, through Laval and Three Rivers, if I'm right on that. We're not sure, but at least all of those cities are on ancestral lands of the First Nations in Quebec. Thank you very much.
S'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you. I have a question for both chiefs. I have trouble reconciling your position, and I'm certainly not intending to minimize what you've said. It's a very important position that you've taken. I understand that on the one hand, you are not against a project of this scope, but that, if I understand correctly, you would prefer, even before the bill be presented and tabled here, you be consulted, and that you continue to be consulted even before a route is planned or proposed or worked out. So I have a bit of difficulty reconciling that, despite the fact that I certainly understand the principles that you're advancing. That being said, though, if we want to undertake a project, once a prospective or possible route will have been decided on, then you would be consulted and all measures be respected to ensure that your rights are respected. Would that be the appropriate way to do business? Otherwise, what approaches do you suggest going forward, if I may? Yes, of course. Thank you so much. I try to be as clear as possible, Honourable Senator. But I did not mention whether I was for or against the project. This is really not my prerogative to say. That would be up to the First Nations across whose lands the high-speed rail network would be laid. We're here to speak to a bill that raises a number of concerns. And that is why we have questions and we are raising red flags on a number of issues, such as that of expropriation, that of consultation, a free, prior, and informed consent with the First Nations. The respect due data, which belongs to First Nations. As for the route, or rather the project itself, it really is a matter to be taken under consideration by First Nations whose lands the route will cross. So I'm here to raise red flags about the bill being discussed. It has a number of gray zones, and they have been pointed out. Clear amendments are required to ensure that it remains constitutional and, of course, respects the rights of First Nations. Thank you for the question.
Just a few other things. I think that we haven't said that we want to be consulted ahead of the legislation being put forward. I think that that is not part of our message. Our message is clear, like my colleague said, is that this is an overreach of government. In order to continue to build upon respectful relationship, the ability to advance projects in a good way, the government cannot have legislation that gives them the ability to override fundamentally important legislation in their back pocket so it does not work. And the approach is completely contrary to fruitful project development. And I think that that is our message here. The expropriation, it gives the government the ability to overextend and expropriate wherever they want, gives the government the ability to exempt entities, which the Crown Corporation of the high-speed rail is an entity, from any federal legislation and obligation that may come from that. And that's a problem. The Government of Canada has a duty to consult with First Nations. When they start in a process, whether it be generally through regulatory or applications for permits, this is the trigger that starts the duty to consult. By giving the government the ability to not have those triggers anymore, creates a lot of uncertainty. It does not absolve the government of the right to duty to consult, but this will result in further delays, because what is going to happen is that the government will misstep the part where they're supposed to consult because the legislation says they can just go ahead and do it, and this will result in a number of significant legal challenges across from Quebec all the way to Ontario. And so the government's objective is to build projects quicker to ensure that there's certainty around investments, but First Nation rights cannot be trampled upon that. And that will cause uncertainty, and that is why we are here to raise that issue.
Merci, Monsieur le
Schwartz,
Président.
do you have any comment to make?
I do not.
Moving on to Senator Arnold.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Been answered, but I thank you all for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. Ms. Schwartz, thank you for recognizing that it is a bold investment in climate change and in climate change mitigation. We know that the way we travel about is one of the biggest detriments to our climate right now. And I'm curious from a data perspective, like I'm sorry, I'm coming from a place of ignorance, but Ontario and Quebec, no one knows exactly where it's going, but have those wildlife corridors been mapped? Do you have asset mapping? Is it done around this? Is someone doing it?
I'm not the best place to answer
Okay.
those questions. I would say with respect to our chapters in both Ontario and Quebec, we'll have more information, and certainly I would encourage the committee to consult directly with those chapters. But any of the route decisions that are made do need to be made with the strongest available science and traditional knowledge. So there's what we've heard so far is that there's potential of a route that would follow, at least in the Ontario portion, around Highway 7. Well, Highway 7 is problematic because there are a number of wetlands along that route. It is probably more complicated logistically to do that route as well. But one thing I will say is that would, unlike the corridor of the existing CN network, it actually would go through relatively what would be called greenfield. So yes, there's lots of local organizations that know quite a bit about the habitats and species that might live in those areas. And so the issue is that because it's greenfield and not industrialized already, you are going to be encountering species. You're going to be encountering habitats that the species have not already learned to move about in a bisected environment. And so in that situation, you are in fact likely to be encountering significantly more problems with wildlife and just with the habitats themselves, not to even mention whether or not species at risk might in fact be found in those regions as well. I mean, it's fairly well known with species at risk where those habitats are, but again, when it's greenfield, those are not always that well established.
Senator Quinn.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone, for being here. So we had Alto here, and they explained that there isn't an exact route right now, but the discussion we're having tonight is kind of steering my questions and whatnot, and that is that, we last year, through Bill S-13, embedded the non-derogation clause in the Interpretation Act. And that was, to me, that's a very important piece because it says that Section 35 rights and Aboriginal rights are to be not only upheld but not to be diminished. And that's an overlay of all legislation and regulatory work that the government does. So where I'm going with all of that, one of those rights in 35 is, of course, consultation. And so would Alto talked about their organization, and they've got 500 people, and they talked about experts from Europe or whatever who have done high-speed rail. Shouldn't we be encouraging Alto, and I'm thinking of our report back, as an observation, shouldn't they be at least having First Nation representatives from an area, they've got to have an idea where they're going. It may not be down to the precise kilometer in terms of width, but they've got to have a corridor in mind. You just mentioned Highway 7. But shouldn't they be having First Nations at the get-go? So as they're planning the route, they have better information that says, we're going to have to move it here, we're going to have to move it there. Would that be something that would be a step forward in respecting the Interpretation Act?
Yeah, I believe the entity of Alto will work within the confines that they're given. But the minister has a role, and the expropriation would be the minister would be doing that. Obviously, the advice of them would be, where the route is. But I do think that they do have a good team working there. They have, they are setting up their system to advance this project. And I believe that they can achieve it without having the legislative ability to expropriate land and the minister sidestepping key legislation and expropriating.
So if I make it, I know we're running out of time. So I know that, we talked also about this is going through two provinces and that the Act embodies 9210C, the Constitution, declaratory power, and that causes the federal government to assume the jurisdiction. And in terms of assuming jurisdiction, because Ontario has its laws and regulations, Quebec has its laws and regulations, is that a progressive step in terms of having a single window to provide that leadership over a project? Ensuring, of course, that they do the things that they're supposed to do relevant to Section 35 rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can only speak from a First Nation perspective. I think that it's all of the same. The government is the government, whether it be the government of Ontario, Quebec, or the federal government. I think that the provinces probably have their own opinion on the government's overreach as well, which I would encourage you to speak to them as well. But First Nations, the pathway forward is having the communities at the table from the beginning, and not with the ultimate threat of being able to do the expropriation if need be.
Very short. Have First Nations been consulted as far as you're aware? Have there been any discussions at all, even preliminary?
Well, the 133 communities that I support in my region are having various conversations with them. Whether or not it's consultation, I do believe it's relationship building at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a fulsome discussion up until this point, and we have a time limitation, so I would like to thank our witnesses for your presence, your questions, your thoughts, which will help us. Clearly, there seems to be a real opportunity, just from an observer's perspective, of building relationships. And building relationships sometimes is a case of timing, too. And so I think that there's a great opportunity for possibly people to pull back a bit and then sort of think, and both sides, we have to create a trust, and there needs to be a trust issue, obviously, from the start of the relationship. And so lots of things to consider in terms of our thought process. So thank you so much for coming to see us tonight. We'll pause for a couple of minutes to set up for our next witnesses, and I thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you.